Hello, this is Gail Ferris, your narrator and photographer. I can't share with you any videography that I took that year because, unfortunately, while I was paddling along, my dry bag dropped off the back of my kayak. It was slightly open and filled up with water, so I drowned my lovely video camera. These are lots of photographs I took with my digital camera, and I was extremely lucky on the way up that the pilots let me sit in the cockpit and take these photographs. I had just the best time getting these views that I would never get otherwise. In this view, we are coming in over Umanak. Umanak itself, the island, does not have its own airport. They attempted to build one, but it slid into the water. So this is the Umanak area in detail from a de Havilland-7. One thing that's interesting is wherever you see turquoise water, such as in this stream, it's water coming from an iceberg that is full of rock flour. Here we are, here. This is to show you how thick rock flour can get to be, and it's dicey paddling in water that is as thick as milk. You can't see the rocks. Now we are on our way into the Umanak area, which has sedimentary terrain, and the airport is on the edge of an island across from Upernavik itself. And I didn't paddle in this area because it is notorious for having katabatic winds, and also sedimentary terrain is very unstable. So I went north to Upernavik because I wanted to paddle in a much more stable environment, that of granite, gabbro, and basalt. I have interspersed some maps among these photographs as we are flying in, and in this instance we are flying over the top of Lexy Fjord entrance, looking at Nordamut Island in the distance, and from there we get to see more views of the various bird cliffs in view, which are noted by their white stone faces, the work of birds, especially cormorants. We are flying diagonally across this map from the entrance of Lexy Fjord over to the tip and beyond of Nordamut Island. In the foreground is Nordamut Island, and the white patch is bird cliffs, and this opens onto Amarqua Passage. This map shows the location of those bird cliffs I have described to you, and we are flying from the bottom to the top of this map. This is another perspective, a little out of focus, but it is Amarqua Passage, where I paddled down on the left side. What you can also see is the famous Greenland ice cap, which I was delighted to be able to once again see. This is lower Amarqua Passage, and along here were really some beautiful minerals to look at. On this map we're flying bottom to top, and in this next view is a very interesting view of Sort Hole on your left with the white cliff faces, but in the back actually is Upernavik Ice Fjord, just filled with ice. And one of the reasons why I chose to paddle in this passage, Amarqua, was to avoid all the ice I knew was down in Upernavik Ice Fjord, just waiting. Even though on the map this doesn't look that serious, and it looks so innocent from this view, I really didn't want to try paddling through this passage for several reasons. One was there was no place to land for many miles, straight vertical cliffs, and when the tide changed, the waves could become very nasty. I chose to paddle through this area and across the opening of Sword Hole because it would be easier to deal with. But also what was lovely along the coast of Sanderson's Hope was that it was the shortest distance to get down to where I wanted to go. This is what it looks like, Sanderson's Hope, from the air as we were on approach to Upernavik. And I was so glad the pilots allowed me the privilege of seeing this and taking photographs from their cockpit. So here we are coming in over Long Island, and we are catching a lovely view just covered with ice of the Ice Fjord. This is a famous mountain called Umiak Mountain because it resembles an umiak, and at its base on the north side is Torsuit Passage, where I've paddled many times. We're looking at an interesting lake on Lang U, or Long Island, and this island also happens to have a deposit of graphite on it, which was once mined. On this map, we are looking from Upernavik toward Upilitok, which is a diagonal to the upper right. These are some of the islands to the north of Upernavik Island, where we are coming in. Now we are looking at Upernavik proper and its runway on top of the island. You can see how Upernavik relates to the ice fjord, which is farther and beyond, but all of the ice that comes out of that ice fjord comes past Upernavik eventually. We are on final approach, and in a few moments we will make touchdown, and this Dash 7 can make a touchdown just about a dime landing. We had a great flight all the way up. It was an exquisite day when we landed in town. And sure enough, this is a view just over the side from the airport, showing where the ice is. It's all over the place. So I'm heading south to visit Amarqua Passage. Driving down from the airport, this is Sanderson's Hope, the mountain that is nearly 4,000 feet high and plunges straight into the sea, which we flew past just a few minutes ago. This is my Mark I long-haul kayak, which I used once again on this trip. It was a wonderful kayak, very, very comfortable to sit in for long hours. After spending a couple days in the town of Upernavik with Gina and John Kislow, where we went out on the water and went fishing, I took off. I had decided to get going paddling very early in the morning because I knew paddling due south is agony into brilliant sunlight. For me, it's such a torture. I'd rather paddle during the wee hours of the morning when it's still quite dark. I got down to Gamelhound and decided to put the boat together its finishing touches and got underway at 4 o'clock in the morning. From there, I paddled southward along this map, and it was quite a visual adventure at first. So there I was, heading out in this exotic golden light, a kind of time and light I had never experienced before in all of my kayaking adventures here in Upernavik. Indeed, I'd been coming and going since 1992. But this was really a very exciting experience with this special light. There was a little wind on the water, nothing to be too particularly concerned with. My Mark I is a very seaworthy kayak, and this was the view of the first large island, In this very blurry picture, the sun is very low on the horizon off to the east. And just happened I turned around in my kayak and clicked this picture, which, even though it's blurry, it still has that wonderful, exotic, early morning light. I was delighted that the water wasn't absolutely deadpan flat. It makes it a lot easier to paddle when there are ripples on the water. And this is the morning glow on two islands. One of them is Greece-oo and the other one is Lang-oo, just off of town. I couldn't believe this golden light. When I flew into Upernavik, I noticed some ice off of this point on Kayak, its westernmost point. It sticks quite out into the sea. I didn't think very much about it, so I thought, well, I'll just paddle over there. I always go this way, and it'll be fine. Well, when I got in the midst of the ice, I realized I was in a big gyre, and it was a very, very scary experience. It was a gyre caused by the tide, which rushes between all of these islands. The tidal exchanges here in this area of Greenland are very powerful. They can be a good 7 knots. I've seen 2 icebergs crisscross right in front of me, and they are such rate that they're moving faster than I can actually paddle. And I began to realize as I thought, oh, I'll just go through the middle of this gyre. Oh, this is all right. Won't be any problem. Well, I suddenly realized I could get swamped and squashed in the middle of this thing. I could actually see a whirl and a depression in it. As the gyre was starting to actually suck me in, I thought to myself, if anything happens to me, nobody will ever know. And that was not a nice feeling. The first time I've really had that feeling of frightened helplessness. Well, much to my relief, it wasn't all that bad, and I was able to get through the gyre, but I won't try that trick again. And I got over to the end of Sanderson's Hope and proceeded to paddle along that familiar coastline. Sandersons can develop some katabatic winds in the summer. I've had that experience because it's very vertical. These are some of the rock faces that I get to paddle by when I go by the bottom of Sanderson's Hope, the westward boundary. And you can see they're really pretty straight up and down. The only way you can land on them is if you happen to be a fly. This is an aerial shot that shows what it looks like, and from the airplane it was surprising to see what it really does look like. But from a boater's perspective, this is all you get to land on, and I realized all along that there was no place to stop and ever get out of the kayak. It's just impossible. And in Upernavik there are loads of places just like this all over, that there's no place to get out of your kayak. But then again, just around the corner can be a convenient place to get out. So I started out at 4 o'clock in the morning and got down to where I was camping at Tunawah at 9 o'clock in the morning. I made that trip in 5 hours. The currents were with me, and that makes paddling a lot easier. The previous time it took me a long time to get from the point Ingia to Tunawah one evening because the current was against me. This is what it looks like in photographs taken in other years of the point Ingia looking down in toward Sort Wool. And you can see the bright colors of the minerals on the rocks that this area is very famous for. Along the cliffs of Tunawah, I am really sorry that in all the times I've passed by them, I never took a photograph of the colors of the minerals. This is what this cliff face looks like from the air as we were on approach, and you can just catch a hint of the pink color to the rock. So beautiful. I came in to an area they had shallow, flat rock slabs, and I thought, oh, this will be fine, easy to get out on. But then every time I tried to step out, a swell from the remaining day's storm kept grabbing me and pulling me back out again. And if I got up on the slab with my bow, the boat would flop over to the side, making a very awkward exit. And just as I was ready to get out, another swell would come in and carry me back out. And there I was, sitting on the stern deck, looking pretty absurd. Then I thought about it. The trick was, all right, I needed some shallow water where I could see the bottom and have the water stay consistently there. So I found a rock corral where I had consistent water, so I sat on the paddle on the stern deck and was able to step over the side very conveniently while all was stable and I wasn't being swept off to who knows where by the backwash of the next swell. With bowline in hand, I was able to get up onto the rock slabs and then put the pool noodles under the hull and roll it up the rock slabs. I rolled it quite a ways up because the rock slabs were very flat and I wanted to be sure I was above the high tide line, which varies because there are a low high tide and a high tide. And that can be quite a surprise, especially in the wee hours of the morning. I was glad I'd brought my boat what seemed like an absurd distance up the rock slabs, but I didn't want to be disturbed by any problems, and I tied it off to a rock. And while I was snoozing away, some fog drifted in. I was glad I had brought a hood. I always find wearing a hood while paddling and even while sleeping very comfortable. One other thing I do when I'm paddling is I always have a pair of binoculars at ready grab around my neck because it's nice to be able to see a coastline that you can't see from your cockpit. So tomorrow I get to cross, and that's going to be interesting. But right now it's nice and calm, which is fine with me. Next morning, this is what I awoke to. It had been a little foggy overnight, which made things a little chilly. I launched from this area at about 8 o'clock in the morning. It was quiet and easy to launch from here. I just used my pool noodles as rollers under the hull since I'm paddling alone, and rolled it right down to the edge of the water, launched, and took off. It was very pretty paddling in this golden mist, and I made the crossing in a couple of hours, and on the way I stopped in 3 different places to take waypoints as records on my GPS. Oh well, my GPS showed only numbers, but I took them as a record in case I might need to use them in the fog, so I thought. But I wasn't able to really extrapolate my positions until just lately. With a simply numeric GPS, I was completely helpless and was not able to extrapolate my position on this map, which is 1 to 250,000. The only way I could finally resolve some questions I had was to consult Google on my computer and type in the position numbers. 2/3 of the way across near Upernavik Island, I was faced with a wind coming up and some waves in my face, which I had to deal with because they were blowing broadside at me on my way across until I got into the wind shadow of the land. One thing I noticed about passing by these small islands is they are always festooned with lots of tussocks of grass, indicating that ducks have always nested on these. I found it very fascinating and completely unexpected when I came into the wind shadow of the opposite side, the east side of this passage, that there was lots of seaweed, which indicated to me beyond all question that this area is a very rich marine resource area. These next few photographs were taken while aboard the Iput in 1995, not from my kayak. With great relief, I rounded the bend at Kasingatok, the opening of Topographic passage. And this is what it looks like in reverse from aboard the Iput in 1995. And this is a moment where we are heading just down this Topographic passage, and the rocks flanking it with the endless waterfalls. There was 4 of them in a row, and I also got to do the same passage in 1993 with all of these waterfalls. However, in the last part of July, early August 2003, there were no waterfalls. It was very hot and very dry down here, and water became quite a serious issue. This is my general route. It's pretty straightforward, right down Topographic. I didn't have to do anything special on the way down. I just kept an eye on the currents and the riffles and any wind that might be in my face to sort of avoid the wind by seeking the wind shadows as I paddled down. The first place I could come in for a landing after all this expanse, and believe you me, I have looked and looked, was at Kayak, which looks like this. And I took this in 1993. You can see on this map that all along the north side are lots and lots of little lines. Those are all the waterfalls that are represented on the map. Next, the map shows the campsite that I came into, which happened to have huge numbers of mussels. And it was a very warm area with very poor water. And believe it or not, with all those mussels, I had forgotten to bring any kind of pan to cook in, and I scrounged all over the place where there was some refuse kicking around, hoping I might come across some kind of a tin that I could boil them up in. But no, I couldn't, so that was unfortunate. Bad choice on my part. But packing a cooking vessel in a kayak, they do take up a lot of space. So for some reason on this trip, I arbitrarily decided not to bring any kind of a cooking pot. Boy, that was a sad decision. I'm paddling along Untitled Island, but I am looking toward the opening out onto Lexy Fjord. It was very exciting to be able to be along these cliff faces because lots of birds lived here. In these aerial photographs you see there are white cliffs facing you just on the middle of the picture. And that was a major goal of mine because I wanted once again to try to see the razorbills that lived on those cliffs. This morning I have paddled across, and now I have once again gotten to the bird cliffs that I had seen in 1993, where I watched razorbills dive off the cliffs, pancake on the water, and take off. They are elegant birds because they are a type of auk. They're also related to puffins. This time, the only thing I saw living there were glaucous gulls. Now I am paddling farther down, and I'm going to be heading around the point. But in front of you is an island which has several sod houses, and alongside of me are numerous sod houses because this area was heavily lived in. It was a wonderful place for hunting. And in this area it was interesting to paddle through because the perspective was such that I couldn't tell whether things were close or far away because of the low angle of the sun. So I had some confusing moments as I was paddling through this area because everything looked like it was just right over there. Here's the map that I followed in 1993, and it looks like it is not open, but actually it is. This was a very exciting moment once again to see in the round. And here I was paddling my kayak through this passage. I continued on for a while, having a good time once again going through the passage at Convic around the face of Nodamute Island, heading eastward. Just as soon as I cleared the protection of the rocks and started heading east on Amarqua, there was wind at my back. Previously I'd been paddling in neutral air. Just as I got to the exposed portion of the passage, I experienced wind at my back. But unfortunately, what also was happening was the tide was running against me, and that made the rest of the paddle down to Nodamute Nuwa a slow, arduous project. At last I got down to Nodamute, the actual village that must have been abandoned in historic times because many people in Upernavik knew of it, and it appears as though people still go there. The other thing that was very interesting while I was there, I noticed, was that lots of duck feathers were lying about because ducks come there to molt. And just to the east of it is a rock escarpment which houses a huge bird colony. And during the evening, while I was trying to sleep, the birds kept me awake. They finally dozed off to sleep at about 4 o'clock in the morning. But also in this village, the soil is very rich, and I found some wonderful wildflowers. I slept just on the edge of the beach, which was a very interesting situation to cope with. There was a very good reason why I slept on the beach, which was crammed right up against a bank of sand. In all of my slogging around up on top, I found there wasn't one place that was either dry or flat, suitable for a tent. So at that point, the only thing I could see that was dry was the sand on the beach down below, along with the fact that I didn't feel like being bothered with hauling all of my stuff up the bank, which was steep. Here is a little detail from the topographic map that shows the village site, which is just in front of the Blue Lake. This is my late afternoon view of the entrance of Lexy Fjord, where I had paddled in 1993 and in 2003. These are some aerial shots of this same area, just to give you some perspective from the air. Okay, so here's the deal. After I looked around, I thought about it, and I said to myself, I don't think I feel like dragging my stuff up to the top of this knoll and having to deal with all of that drudgery. Plus, it's wet up here. So I figured, okay, I'll risk it. I'll camp on this beach. And I looked around, and in the foreground you can see the remains of a pallet. I figured, well, that's pretty safe. Alright, so here's my tent. I gotta make this thing fit in what space there is. So I looked around and noticed that, yeah, I could just get it in. But I'm staking it into sand, and sand is notorious. So then I had to figure out one of my old tricks. I looked around, and sure enough, there was a smorgasbord of rocks lined up along the top of the beach. Some were small, and some were nice and big. So I figured the next trick was grab a small one and grab a big one. And the rock in the tent, you put a big rock. And that trick works if the wind doesn't blow, which it didn't that night, so I got away with that one. And the tent is floorless, so that makes it easier to put up. And I always sleep on ground cloths, so I was fine. The next trick was, okay, how are we getting the boat up this beach? And the problem is with soft pool noodles on sand is they sort of squish in half. But luckily on the beach were some logs, about 6-inch diameter. Well, the more I looked at those logs, the more they talked to me. And then the idea came to my mind. The best thing is get everything out of the kayak, make it as light as possible, put it on those logs, and roll it up the beach. And sure enough, I got it up to the very top of the beach because I had a sneaky little feeling that the tide was going to be up, because this beach is a very shallow beach, and I was really taking a chance. And I thought, well, I can strand myself on top of the wood pallet, and as long as the boat is tied off to some rocks, probably I'll be all right. But you just never know. Luckily, the tide didn't come up that high that night, so I had no problem. It peaked out at 2100, and I can tell you, looking at the beach, it was just a tiny strip where I had erected my tent and was now preparing to go to sleep. Oh boy. The only problem was, alright, what am I going to do when I get to the next sandy beach? I'm not going to paddle along with these big heavy logs on my stern deck. That's not a good idea. Oh well. Then I went to sleep. I was beastly tired, but next door was this little happy crowd of birds, and they rhythmically would wake me up with all their calling and talking. They finally stopped around 3 o'clock in the morning, and that woke me up. So you just never know. When you're sleeping next to a bird colony right next door, it can sure keep you up. I never had this experience before. Oh well. I didn't have to move the tent, thank goodness, in the middle of the night with water lapping at my feet. But the next morning, I woke, had my usual breakfast, and when I got underway, I looked in the water and was fascinated to see what is perfectly predictable, and that is the water is very heavily enriched with all the bird droppings. And this is what it looked like. I'd never seen such dense seaweed ever. And this is my route that I started out on this day. Another fascinating paddling experience. You just never know what you're going to see. I woke in the morning at the usual time, had my breakfast with a nice cup of coffee, and then proceeded with the next project, and that was, how do you get your boat down the beach after I had packed up my tent? So first order was to get my dry suit on, because after I get the boat down to the bottom of the beach, I need to load it while it is floating. I was very glad that this boat happens to have loading ports, because that makes it much easier to stuff everything in without drowning yourself at midship trying to stuff things into the stern and bow sections. It was a nice sunny morning, as you can see in this photograph, and there was just a soft wind blowing. What I thought was a good idea was to see what was at the bottom of the cliff where the birds lived. And as you can see in this picture just over the side, there's a huge population of seaweeds. Now, of course, I was continuing east, and I was going to go into the next inlet called Nuritit, and in there look for possible places where people had lived. As I paddled along and started to go around the entrance, I noticed to the west was a whole slew of very much rounded granite with cliffs overlooking the water, with areas large enough to erect a tent. I saw lots of lush green grass and very green hummocks in this area. I couldn't resist. I got out of my kayak, tied it off, and climbed up to look around. When I climbed up, I really had my ideas confirmed, because there was this wonderful outcrop that you could stand on or you could live on, and you could see what was happening everywhere very easily. And there was very dense, lush tussocks of willow and all kinds of plants growing in this area. It was the perfect place to live and keep a lookout on everything that was going on. And up behind there were lush patches of berries. Thick tussocks is very difficult to walk over without falling down, were such a strong indicator that lots of people had lived here and come and gone. Even if they didn't live here over the winter, they sure came here in the summer and lived in their summer tents. As friends of mine in Amarqua and Upernavik said, they used to love to go back and forth in these areas in their umiaks. One of them was Ollie Tolaevson's mother, and that was just thrilling to hear. I remember the smile on her face when she described how much fun it was to go down in the fjords berry gathering in the summer. The sod house walls, still remaining, had plants growing 6 inches high, and in the foreground is a hole filled with large boulders, which must have been a meat cache. I paddled around the rim, along the north edge of the rim, and just investigated whatever I could think of from my kayak. It was quite shallow in here, which I thought was rather interesting. Most of the edges of this area were easy to get out on if you were paddling in umiak. And this is the view looking at the clouds as I happened to be standing there around noon. This was in the easternmost portion, and it was just extensive flat rock terraces. The extensive golden brown color is a bunch of sphagnum, and I walked up these terraces to look for what I thought was a freshwater pond, and I got up on the top and there was nothing. It was bone dry. So that just added to my conclusion that water is quite scarce in this area this time of year. It's now hot and dry. As I'm standing here looking back to where I have come from, far behind is that magnificent entrance to Lexy Fjord. And there's no other place in the world that quite looks like that. But in the foreground is a peninsula of rock, which must have been a very interesting igneous intrusion, some sort of a dike. It looked like it was almost a perfect cylinder. Never seen anything quite so dramatic before in my life. Wow, I was really amazed to see such a perfect cylindrical shape in stone. Just amazing geology to see here in this region. I'm standing in the farthest east portion of this map, and it's interesting to look at that dike that's in the middle, and further beyond that are some very interesting metamorphosed geological formations which were straight up and down cliffs. I very eagerly paddled to the bird nesting site, only to come across herring gulls, which I hadn't really seen before in great number, cormorants, and little moors. There were no auks, and I was disappointed. Oh well. This is a photograph taken from Sword Hole in 1995. However, what was interesting, for the first time I found a herring gull rookery. So that was quite exciting. Paddling back out was interesting along these cliffs, which were dark brown layers interspersed with tan. But then here and there were areas with basalt boulders and trap rock that was columnar. And then as I got to the outside, I started to come across some interesting wave conditions I hadn't thought about before. I thought I'd have some fun and play some games with the swells and waves. But then my way out around, I really got myself in a surprising situation. My rudder wasn't deployed and my cockpit wasn't fully closed, because what happened was I wasn't quite prepared to be dealing with waves that were generated by the wind that were hitting the rocks that were facing due west, and the wind was coming from the west, and I was dealing with some nasty backwash from the waves. I almost wound up smashed against the rocks. I had to be careful to get myself out of there and not tangled up on the rocks. And one of the other things was to make sure my rudder was down deep enough to be able to control where I was going. When I first encountered these backwashing waves, I hadn't really bothered with my rudder very much, and I got my kayak stuck in irons. And that's a nasty feeling because you can't control your direction. So I had a real trick on my hands getting myself situated so I could get out of there, get my rudder down. I had a few dicey moments that made me realize, don't be so casual when you're paddling your kayak. You can get into big trouble, and the worst thing in the world is to wind up smashed against some rocks. I can tell you, being in irons and being nearly smashed against rocks made me pretty jittery. So, in great humility, I paddled farther east down with the wind pushing me, and I was on to my next campsite. And on the way were some fascinating, very beautiful cliffs I got to enjoy looking at. What a relief it was to get around that peninsula at Neritut and to be able to then paddle downwind. But one wonderful thing about this boat I am using is that I had adjusted the foot pedals and the seat just right so that the kayak really fit my body, so it was part of my body. I was able to handle dizzying kalpadas very well, just because I had planned in advance to be absolutely comfortable in my cockpit. Going downwind is always kookabook paddling, but I was so snug in my cockpit I was able to focus on what was happening and integrate my paddle stroke with the waves. So I made a most efficient use of all of my paddling strokes. Along the way were these cliffs, which had some very interesting minerals in them. Some of them were strikingly pink. There was lots of examples of broken rock here and there, streaming down the hillsides. There was hardly anywhere I could actually come in for a landing if I needed to. But I had a delightful time just looking at these minerals. Okay, here we are looking at the minerals. Right. What I was also hoping for, and you can see in this picture, some water coming down. Okay. And there's beautiful metamorphosed minerals there. So I tried to paddle in closely enough so that I might be able to just dip up some water on my paddle. Now, if you look at this map, oh, look at that. There's 4 brooks, 5 of them coming down. Surely there must be some water, and that water in the picture, I must be able to get up to that and take some. It can't be all that difficult here. Right. That's a bright idea. I'll just paddle in there. Well, I did. I found that the water disappeared in the rocks and was completely unavailable to me. So I knew I was in for a trek down to whatever next place there was that I might hopefully find some water. Now, if you look at these 2 pictures, there's something not quite right. Well, I can tell you from experience what isn't quite right. It's a very hot day, and there's no snow on top. All of the snow by late July had melted off, and that had been the supply for all of the waterfalls on the map. Now that was all gone. I started to get a little alarmed and daunted about the water. I realized if I didn't find water, I was in some trouble. So I continued down the coast, thinking, well, it can't be that hopeless. And indeed, it wasn't. I got to pull in to the next place, Omianak. And indeed, there was water there in abundance, bubbling down the hill. And I was relieved. There actually was a lake up on top with a robust feed to it. I could actually hear and smell the water. So acute was my need for water when I came in. And it was high tide. I was able to paddle up in among the rocks and get my kayak up inside a little bit. But I did wind up camping along the top of the beach on the grassy hummocks. What also was really exciting, and of course music to my ears, there was a pair of Arctic loons out in the bay. That was just a thrill. This was my first time in Greenland coming across loons. Of course they're everywhere, but they aren't quite so common as you might expect in Greenland. At least not where I was. After relaxing that night and really so enjoying the brook with its wonderful water. It was a large brook. The next morning got underway and headed for the next place. I was paddling farther east out of Amarqua Passage along Nodamute, and the rock cliffs had beautiful colors in them, some strikingly pink rocks. And I was still thinking, of course, where's the next place I can get water? Let's look around. So in the next picture, you can see this dark area in the middle. Well, yeah, that's a waterfall, all right. There's only one problem. When I tried to get close to it, the water simply disappeared in the rocks, and trying to get out of my kayak was not a realistic option because it was nothing but sharp rocks to get out on and precarious rocks to try to stand on, as the water disappeared into the ground completely away from where I could ever get at it, no matter what I tried. I also thought about, there used to be a time when I rigged up things on the end of my paddle to try to get things like water. Even that would have never worked because the water was way up inside. It showed me once again that even though a brook is illustrated on a map, that doesn't mean it's actually running. But what also was interesting was that the rock was very beautiful in this area, and birds lived on these rocks. These rocks, even though a lot of them were just plain cuboidal trap rock chunks, lots of trap rock, basalt, there was also areas with hornblende and pure black and feldspar, different colors, especially white feldspar. Very pretty to look at. As I was paddling due east, at first there was very little breeze, but then later in the afternoon, as the fjords warmed up, the cold air from the inner glacier came down the fjords and blew in my face at about 10 or so knots. A thing that happens every day. The cliffs gave way to sloping down into a gentle valley area, and that was really the highlight of the trip because at long last I had reached the area where amazot are traditionally caught in these brooks that come down the valley you see in the middle of this picture. You can't see the brooks from where I'm looking at it from the cockpit, but they're there, and they're quite large actually. They come out through a stone dike along the edge of the beach. When I pulled up to the beach, it was a very shallow, sloping beach covered with beautiful colored stones of red feldspar and other feldspar colors, the same as what I'd seen behind Pilatok. I got out. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which was just fine with me, and the boat, I just moored it up on the sand, opened the hatches, and took out the series of dry bags that had everything in them. I set up my tent and then thought I would just let the tide bring the boat up, since I knew that high tide would be at about 8 o'clock in the evening. I eagerly went and visited the 2 beautiful brooks and looked at all of the arrangements people had left behind for catching amazot. It was fun to see these babbling brooks among all of the pebbles. And I camped on the beach because up above it was just too wet. Trying to set up a tent among boggy hummocks like these was just not practical. So I was content with camping on the beach and spent a comfortable evening every once in a while checking the kayak to bring it up a little higher and a little higher. I went up above and walked around and found a grand smorgasbord of all kinds of very sizable plants, and in among them were blueberries, and that was great fun because I so enjoy feasting on blueberries. I can see why people really had a good time coming here, and why they always talk about going for blueberries in the fjords, because they sure don't grow on the outside, but they grow on the inside of these fjord areas. Plants in general grow in these lush areas where the winds don't scour the soil. The soil in this area was a nice, thick, rich layer. But on the bank north of here was Kayak, the place where people did live for a long time and had a large structure in that area. And I could see why they lived there, because it wasn't wet. Heading farther down, this area is a narrows. And that was exciting to see, because it really was a dramatic change from what I had been dealing with, passages that were a mile or so wide at this point. Now they were really starting to squeeze down. There were some more bird colonies along here, and what was really very interesting was the rock was starting to turn into this tan sandstone metamorphosed rock, very different than the basaltic area I had just come from. I continued along, enjoying looking at the rocks and the bird colonies, but then I got down to this pair of islands that you see with the white from the birds, and here's where I had a catastrophe where I really did drown my video camera. See how nice and close this ice is? Well, I wasn't paying any attention, and what happened was not that the ice was floating next to me or I was floating next to it. It was actually rolling over on the deck of my kayak. And that was really not the thing to do. Letting yourself get submerged by a rolling over piece of ice is just not the thing you do as a kayak paddler, to say the least. In my complete alarm, I had carelessly placed my video camera in its dry bag on the stern deck, but it only rolled over the rollover seal once. And the next thing I knew, I felt something strange, and I was towing the poor thing with it open, and it was filling up with water, and that was why I don't have any video footage for you, because I drowned my video camera. After drowning the camera, I continued on because I knew this was a hopeless case, and I got up to an area that is very near a famous place where the hunters throw their kayaks on their shoulders and carry them across a narrows on Nodamut Island so that they can paddle around to Pitatok. This is what it looked like on the water, but I can tell you, I sure was shocked when I was taking pictures to suddenly discover that I was having an encounter with an iceberg. Not a very big one, but enough of size and weight to push my kayak right under while I was oblivious. I did encounter this corral of ice on the way, and I have been in that experience before where there's a bunch of ice across, and what I did was just simply scout around to look for an opening, which there was, and then eventually I pulled into shore. This map shows where I was camping, and it shows the passage next to what's called Fangst House, which is a hunter's cabin, and it was a rather muddy, boggy area. I actually had trouble finding a dry place to camp. And then a couple days later, I took off and paddled across Uvingasok. And here is a view of the glacier from where I was crossing. Now I crossed over to Saningasok Island, and I wanted to take photographs of the shoreline, which was very user-friendly. This I realized I'd not done before. I couldn't resist taking advantage of this special opportunity. Rather fun also was getting to go by an island that had always been used by hunters as a place to sort of hide out. And it was Adam Krim that told me, oh yeah, everybody uses that island. Also, the eider ducks have their nests on that same island. It's just a good lookout point between Uvingasok and Saningasok Islands. This insignificant island doesn't look like much, except when you're paddling by in a kayak. You can see its topographic advantages, which is why the hunters used it as a good lookout. Okay, so the project is I am going to paddle partway around Saningasok, and then I'm going to cross over to the mainland. Well, that turned out to be an interesting project. A little too interesting after a while. So here's the edge of Saningasok. A lovely, hospitable shore, but not exactly perfect for tenting, and who knows where the water is. Here's the Narrows coming up, so familiar to me. And I can see the bird cliffs off to the side. And then I continue paddling on. And then the next thing I knew, I thought I knew where I was. So I decided, okay, I'm crossing over. Oh boy. Well, I never did cross to where I thought I was crossing. I crossed to another island instead. But I did experience some interesting paddling. I came upon the tidal intersection between Neku and Saningasok Island, and there occurred a huge whirlpool demarcated by chips of ice. And this was the first time I'd seen a really gigantic whirlpool. I paddled through it and was relieved to get to the other side. From there was to start to paddle along what now turned out to be the shore of Nako Island. While I was paddling along this north shore of Nako Island, I came across this fascinating boulder that was split off as though somebody had cut it with a knife. And I couldn't resist taking this photograph of it to show you. It's so unique in a lot of ways. Who would believe? And from there, I started paddling up and around. And while I was paddling, I started to become quite tired, because what happened was a stiff wind was blowing down between the two islands from the outside. So finally I got to a place where I was delighted to come across a Horseshoe Bay, a little tiny one, very protected, but I was able to tuck in there and set up camp. In this tiny bay, I found that the top of the beach was clay soil, but it supported very robust plant life. What I did was tie the boat off. I set up my tent in where I thought it was above the tide line, because I saw grass growing. Well, that wasn't true. It was grass that could take saline conditions. And I failed to notice a few pieces of fucus. At 11 o'clock at night, I felt this light pushing on my feet, and I heard a little sound outside like water. And I realized, well, it wasn't a polar bear, but it was the tide. Well, it was a lucky thing. I always use a bivy bag over my sleeping bag because my tent is floorless. But you never saw anybody get out of their sleeping bag and get into their shoes and get their tent up above the tide line, as I did that night. As for my boat, I thought it would be just fine. I had tied it with some polyethylene throw line off to some big rocks. But I had suspected this could happen. But what was happening was the boat was floating free because the line, when you try to use it underwater with knots in it, just simply undoes itself. If there's one thing I learned as I had to get everything up another 10 feet up the beach or so, was that when you see a few pieces of fucus in the grass, you better believe the tide brought it. The next morning was nice and sunny and bright, and what I did was I used the remains that people had left around on the beach of fishing nets that had floated in, and slid the boat on that nice slippery nylon fishing nets made out of. That was perfect. Oh well, I took off heading west, assuming I knew just exactly where I was. But actually, this view really is Nodamute Island across the way. However, I found some bird nesting sites, and I couldn't remember whether they existed or not. But then I started paddling robustly along and encountered some interesting views that were unfamiliar. And this was one of them. Well, if you really don't want to know what I was doing, I was paddling down around to a place that turned out to be a hunter's cabin. Oh, that was really a shock. On my way down, I took some wonderful pictures in the shallows of the prolific sea life in this area. What was great fun while I was down in these shallows was that I came across a huge group of these moon jellyfish out swimming, and I had never seen them in such profusion. I kept vigorously paddling along until I suddenly arrived at this hunter's cabin. I was completely shocked. I couldn't believe my eyes, and I realized this is not a joke. I have no idea where I am, and I decided I am turning around and getting out of here, and I'm going to paddle back to the outside where I recognize the landmark of Lexy Fjord. Earlier, when I was coming around the outside of Naku Island, I happened to take this picture from this location, and this was before I went down to the hunter's cabin by accident. What it was that was so important in this picture was I could see the entrance to Lexy Fjord. So I had an idea where I might be. And when I got finished with my escapade wandering around down below, I came back out again, and here was my goal, to paddle past this and to camp on this island. The next morning I couldn't be out of there soon enough, and in this light I took off. I was never so glad in my life to be able to see some landmarks I could recognize, and I also experimented with my camera to catch images of the waves as they were just rising up. That was an exciting moment for me. This is Nodamute on the other side. This is Lexy Fjord, the familiar entrance. I really didn't care what. I paddled like a bat out of hell. And I got to Nodamute, where I found these wonderful bird cliffs that I had on the map. Now I am looking at Kamvik, the opening, and the bird cliffs on the other side of it, where I took some more pictures just to confirm my observations that yes, there are razorbills here. This is my general route, but actually I hugged more on the Lexy Fjord side. But I am sorry to say I had originally planned to go down and visit Lexy Fjord again and the fishing area down there. I just didn't feel like dealing with this blistering heat. So I was only too happy to just turn around and head back for a campsite I had stayed at in 1993. And I knew there had to be water there because there is a very active spring that runs off the middle of the island right down to the beach, which indeed there was. I started out paddling the length of Torsukatuk Passage at about 1:30 in the morning, and when I got down nearly to the end, I happened to look around. I just had the feeling there was something special, and sure enough, there's the moon. I couldn't believe it. It was one of those rare moments when you get to see the moon, and that is the last time I got to see it. In the middle of this map, between Singanarnog and Angatosok, is where the moon is actually showing. And I just happened to be sitting in my kayak at that moment. But while I was in my kayak, I thought, well, I'll just keep paddling and I'll get to the end and I'll get to see the moon again. But no, that was not possible to happen because the moon had already set by the time I got to the end. For all the years I have paddled in Upernavik, it's almost never I've gotten on the water in these early hours of the morning. And now, when I look at this picture and remember the moment, I wish I had done this more often because it's a fascinating moment in the time of day. In this topographic map, which is not really illustrating just exactly how I paddled, but roughly where the two wind arrows are is where I stopped on Upernavik Island to just get out and check my boat for some reason. And it was there that I discovered I had forgotten to close my stern hatch. I couldn't believe I could have done something like that. And I had paddled through some waves, but I was just plain lucky my stern compartment hadn't filled up with water. Because paddling a kayak with a loaded stern, especially loaded with water, gets to be interesting. I took this photograph from Upernavik Island and I enclosed a map just to show where I was in relation to the landmarks, which are the very famous rocks and bird cliffs of Swordhole. I was having a very nice somber crossing. In the background is a triangular shaped mountain. That is Sanderson's Hope, one of the most perfectly shaped mountains ever. It's all of columnar basalt. Here is that general topographic map, and I passed by Amarqua Point in the somber hours of the morning. This is what it looks like from the air, and this is the topographic map of Sanderson's Hope. After all the years of paddling by here in the late afternoon hours with lots of waves tossing me up and down, I finally took some photographs of what it really does look like at the base of Sanderson's Hope when you're in your little kayak. I had had so much fun, I was overwhelmed and I couldn't wait to get back to town. So I just hauled along. But what was very interesting when I got off Langeau was something really frightening. Okay, now doesn't this picture look just lovely, somber and quiet? No, absolutely nothing is going to happen in this picture, right? Well, that was about what was happening to me as I was paddling by Langaʻu. And I can tell you, here's another picture with loads of icebergs. Now, which one is the one that's going to break? You want to try and guess that one? Okay. Okay, here's a couple of definite unstable ones. Which one in this picture is going to break? So, just as I'm paddling by the middle of this island, not exactly this island in the picture, but Langaʻu, there was this innocent looking iceberg, and the thing blew up with a tremendous crack of thunder. It scared me so thoroughly, every hair on my body stood up. I just about threw my paddle up out of my hands. I've never forgotten that. What a tremendous crash that iceberg made. I still remember it, and it just goes to show you, you can never tell what's going to happen with an iceberg. But when you hear an ominous clicking sound, that means it's going to break. If you're that close to hear the clicking sound. Instead, this thing just gave up with an explosive roar. It took a little bit more time because I think the tide was against me, but I paddled into town, and that was the end of another trip. This had been really quite a learning experience. And then from there, Gina Kieslow, who's in this picture, and I went out with her husband John to gather mussels in Tortuga Passage, and we went for a boat ride in the islands north of Upernavik, the Dusak area, where I got to see from a motorboat what ice can look like in the fjord area. That was interesting to me to see from a motorboat, views that I'd rather avoid in my kayak when it's this much ice all around. Everything was changing. The ice is always on the move, and in late August the sun was starting to set. I was very lucky to be able to actually enjoy the privilege of watching the sun set around midnight in Upernavik. I've been there before many times. Thank you for watching my video. This is Gail Ferris, your narrator.